So I had a request on one of my last Blazor testing videos to go through and be able to test something with an example. And I wanted to put this content together, and the way that I had to approach it is going to involve some techniques that a lot of people aren't really a fan of. We're going to have to start using some tools within C# that not a lot of people like to lean on, but I do think there's a time and a place for them. So in this video, we're going to be looking at how we can test and look at some different things that have to do with the page declaration on our Blazor pages. And I wanted to say thanks to the person for requesting this, and if you yourself are watching this and trying to develop Blazor applications, whether it's testing or something else, or even if it's unrelated to Blazor and just C# related, please feel free to ask questions in the comments. I'm happy to try and put some content together to help you out. Alright, so what is this technique or this tool that we have within C# that not a lot of people like to lean on? Well, it's reflection. And I do think that there's a time and a place for reflection. I like writing content about using plugins, and I use a reflection a lot for that. But in this particular case, we're going to be using reflection to examine some of the properties that we have within a page. So with that said, let's jump right over to Visual Studio and get started. All right, so on my screen, I have the counter Blazor page, and this is just one of the pages that comes from the template project when you create a new Blazor project within Visual Studio. We're not going to be focused on all of the content that you see on the screen, except for this one thing right at the top, which is the @page declaration. And the request that I had was, what can we do with respect to being able to test this? And to be honest, I wasn't totally sure what things we had available to us in order to assert and check different things regarding the page declaration. And I also hadn't sat there and considered the different reasons why we might want to test this. So I thought it was a great request, a good exercise for myself, and I wanted to share the learnings with all of you. So specifically, we are going to be looking at this @page declaration. And what I found online that was interesting is that this page, this whole Razor page that we're looking at, will get compiled into a class that has attributes that go along with this page declaration. And that means if we have something like attributes, we can use reflection to examine the class that's created as a result of this Blazor page. And that means with reflection and looking up attributes, we can go look up different information and assert that it's what we expect. I have other videos about testing stuff in ASP.NET, in particular the routes or looking at dot comments, so I'll link one of those right up here and you can go check that out as well. But this is the same type of technique that I used for those types of tests. What we're going to be doing is using reflection to examine the type that's created as a result of that Blazor page that I had on the screen. So even though the syntax we're looking at is that Razor syntax, right? We have the @page declaration, some HTML, a code block. All of that's going to get turned into a class. And that @page declaration becomes an attribute on that class. So we'll use reflection. We're going to examine the type. In this case, the page is called counter. So we'll have a counter class. We're going to pull off that attribute from that type, and we're going to see if it matches what we expect. Is this base case really that valuable? Maybe not necessarily, but let's walk through it and we'll see what we can do afterwards with something a little bit more complex. All right, so on my screen now, I just have the counter page test that we looked at in one of the past videos, and I'm going to scroll down to this new test that we have right at the bottom. And you'll notice that it's not that complicated, and as I'm going to explain it, you might be figuring it out on your own. So what I'm doing in this particular test is that we're going to be getting the type of the counter page, like I had just explained, and we're going to ask for the custom attributes. This parameter that we pass in as true is just to look for inherited attributes as well. I don't think it's totally necessary in this case, but I figured why not include it just to make sure we can find the attribute we want. And that's going to give us back an array of attributes. From there, I'm using an xunit assert single method, and what that allows us to do is check this array of page attributes that we've just created and look for one that matches this route attribute. I technically don't need this name alias here. That's a bit of a spoiler for what we're going to look at next. So this is going to give us, if there's only a single attribute, a reference to that page route attribute. And this test is going to fail if somehow the compiled code actually resulted in having multiple page attributes. Now, I don't even think that's possible, so this is really just a sanity check, and the whole point of this is just that we're trying to get this reference right here to our page declaration attribute. From there, there's not a whole lot that we have access to with that attribute, but what it does have is a property called template on it. And template in this case, if I jump back to the page declaration, is going to match this text right here. So if we want to check what we have access to, we can just check to see if that's going to have counter. And that's exactly what we're doing here with this assertion. So we're asserting that the template is equal to counter. So as I mentioned, this particular example, it's not super interesting. The most interesting part is the realization that that page declaration is an attribute, and that if we want to test things with attributes, we can use reflection to do that. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, people seem to not really like using reflection for different reasons, and I totally agree that it can get overused, but I don't think this is an overuse of reflection. In fact, I think it's a really good use of reflection because we're able to examine some of the type information that we otherwise wouldn't be able to see. Okay, so what does a more complex example look like here, and what can we do about it? Well, the template that we have in the page declaration doesn't just have to be a constant value for text. There can be parameters in that. So what might that look like? So on my screen now, I've created a new page in Blazor, and it's called page with parameter. And we can see at the top, I have the @page declaration, and I've changed things slightly. So it's not just called the counter page that we had before, but it's actually slash page with param, another slash, and then this syntax here with the curly brace, and then the phrase the parameter followed by another closing curly brace. And if we look at the bottom of this file, I actually do have a parameter that's called the parameter. You can see that it's also marked with this attribute called parameter. So we have some interesting things going on here. The core of the page isn't really that interesting. It's just that it's going to have a title and a header, and then some text on it that's going to reflect the value of that parameter. But we're not totally interested in looking at that right now. We can go look at the previous videos I've created to play around with how we test this stuff. We're really focused on this part right here. So based on what we have access to, what can we and what should we be testing with regards to the page declaration? Well, in my opinion, and based on the previous test, we were really just looking to see if this matched a static value that was mapped to the name of the page. But in this particular case, because we have a parameter here, something that I thought would be interesting to test is, do we have a matching parameter on this page that we want to make sure is declared and aligned with what we have in the page declaration? So for example, we could check to make sure that if we didn't have this, that this would be a problem. Obviously, this code's not compiling here, so maybe if that wasn't displayed in some text, this code right here might not really be useful. You might want to be able to prove that you have a variable that can hold the parameter that's passed in on the page route. Is that necessary? Is it required? Not necessarily, but if you wanted to have tests that could check that out for you, I think that could be valuable. And you might want to consider this in the inverse way. So what if you wanted to have this parameter here and you had it declared, but you forgot to declare it up at the top here? If you wanted to make sure that that was present, the test that we're going to look at is going to give us that opportunity. So jumping over to the test that we have, I haven't actually come up with a good name for it yet, but we can get creative and call it something like page declaration matches parameter declaration. And I really think that defines what we're going to be looking at here. So this particular test is going to mention that we have a parameter that's named the parameter, because I'm not that creative with naming things, but that's okay. The page, we're going to try to pull off that attribute just like we did in the other case. But the difference here is I'm going to be checking that the template is matching page with param followed by the parameter name. And just to be clear, this syntax here might look a little bit confusing, but that's because we're using string interpolation and because we need to be working with a string that also has curly braces. So we use the double curly braces to escape a curly brace, but then we still need a curly brace to embed the parameter name. So this part right here from lines 22 till 27 is going to give us the ability to assert that we have a page declaration as we expect. So it's really just checking to make sure that this part exists in our page declaration. But that's only one part of the test. It's very similar to what we had before, except I've now moved part of that check or the assertion directly into this lookup here. But what about the rest of it? What about that parameter that we had that we wanted to check out? Well, in order to get that, we can use a similar technique where we get the type of page with parameter, and then we ask for all of the properties on it. From there, we can use xunit with the assert.single, the same as we used above, except instead of checking for this route information, we can actually check to see if the name of the parameter matches the name that we're expecting. We declare it up here on line 20. If we do find a matching one, we can then take another step that makes sure that the property with the name we're looking at also has a parameter attribute on it. So very similar syntax. It's going to look very similar to what we have up top here, but we're going to be asking for that parameter name property. So this is a property info from reflection. We're going to ask for the custom attributes on it, and then from there, using assert.single, this is going to give us a predicate where we can try to step through each attribute and make sure that the attribute type matches parameter attribute. And just to be clear about what parameter attribute is, if I jump back to the Blazor page, that's looking for this right here. It might be a little bit confusing, but parameter attribute and parameter are really the exact same thing. It's just syntactic sugar that you're able to take off the attribute part because it's able to infer that it is in fact an attribute. So to summarize the test that we have here, the first portion, like I mentioned, this part is going to be looking at page declaration. It's very much like the last test that we looked at, so nothing too unique, except for that I'm actually checking the name of the page declaration right inside of this assert.single predicate that we have. But the interesting part that I added on here is that using reflection, we can use another technique to pull the properties off of this page, and based on the property that we find matching the name that we're interested in, we can then go check to make sure that it has a parameter attribute on it as well. So quickly jumping back to the Blazor page, we're now proving that this declaration is as we expect and that we have a property that's going to go alongside with this page declaration. So this part here, the parameter, matches this property name as well. And that's going to wrap up today's video on testing some Blazor functionality using reflection, which isn't something that people like to lean into. Reflection is super powerful and allows us to look up information on types, which is really cool, but a lot of the time people see how cool it is and then they try abusing reflection to do things that they probably shouldn't. C# is a strongly typed language. We should leverage that for what it's worth, but I think that there's some interesting opportunities where we can explore type information, especially in scenarios like testing when we want to make sure that things or types are configured the way that we expect. Thank you so much for watching. If you have other ideas, like I said in the beginning in this video, about things you want to see tested or different ideas for videos that you want to see coverage on for C#, just let me know in the comments and I'm happy to help. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.